I speak 7 languages, the girl said proudly. The millionaire laughs, but is in shock. I speak 7 languages, the 12-year-old girl said, looking directly into the eyes of Richard Sterling. The billionaire burst into cruel laughter in front of all the executives. Maya, daughter of the janitor, didn't lower her gaze. What came from her lips next left Richard in complete shock. Richard Sterling adjusted his $200,000 Patek Philippe watch while observing with absolute disdain the boardroom on the 35th floor of his corporate tower in the heart of Manhattan. At 52, he had built a financial empire that had made him one of the richest men in America, with a personal fortune of $4.2 billion, but also one of the most arrogant people in the country. His office was an obscene monument to his unbridled ego, walls of imported black marble from Italy, artwork that cost more than entire mansions, and a 270-degree panoramic view that constantly reminded him he was literally above all the mortals crawling through the streets like insignificant ants. But what Richard enjoyed most wasn't his astronomical wealth, it was the cruel power this wealth gave him to humiliate and destroy those he considered inferior. Mr. Sterling, his secretary's trembling voice interrupted his thoughts of superiority through the golden intercom. Eleanor and her daughter have arrived for cleaning. Send them in, he responded with a cruel smile that slowly spread across his tanned face. Today, I'm going to have some fun. For the past week, Richard had been meticulously planning his favorite game of public humiliation. He had received, as part of a family inheritance, an ancient document written in multiple languages that the city's best translators had declared impossible to decipher completely. It was a mysterious text, with characters that blended between Sanskrit, ancient Greek, Hebrew, and other languages that not even university specialists could identify. But Richard had turned this into his most cruel personal entertainment. At that moment, the glass door opened silently. Elena Vasquez, 44 years old, entered with her impeccable navy blue uniform, pushing her cleaning cart that had been her faithful companion for the past 7 years, working in this building. Behind her, with hesitant steps and a worn but clean school backpack, came her daughter Maya. Maya Vasquez was 12 years old, and the perfect antithesis of the obscenely luxurious world surrounding her. Her black shoes, though polished with care, had seen better days. Her public school uniform was patched but immaculate, and her library books protruded from a backpack that had clearly been passed down through several older siblings. Her eyes, large and curious, contrasted dramatically with the submissive and fearful look her mother had developed after years of being treated as invisible. "Sorry, Mr. Sterling," Elena murmured with her head down, exactly as she had learned Richard expected. "I didn't know you had a meeting. My daughter came with me today because I have no one to leave her with. We can come back later, if you prefer." "No, no, no." Richard stopped her with a laugh that sounded like a predator's bark. "Stay. This is going to be absolutely entertaining." He stood up from behind his black marble desk, his eyes gleaming with the cruelty of someone who had found new prey to torture. He walked around them like a shark circling, enjoying the obvious terror in Eleanor's eyes and the confusion in little Maya's. "Eleanor, tell your daughter what mommy does here every day," he ordered with a venomous smile. "Maya already knows, sir." "I clean the offices," Eleanor responded in a low voice, her hands gripping the cart handle until her knuckles turned white. "Exactly. Cleans," Richard clapped sarcastically, his voice loaded with contempt. "And tell me, what's your education level, Eleanor?" Eleanor felt the heat of humiliation rising to her cheeks. "Sir, I finished high school, just high school." Richard exploded in cruel laughter that echoed throughout the office. "And here you have your little daughter, who probably inherited the same mediocre genes." Maya felt something strange moving inside her chest. For years, she had seen how other children in her class lived in big houses, had new clothes, and their parents picked them up in luxury cars. She had accepted that her family was different, that they had less, but she had never seen someone humiliate her mother in such a direct and cruel way. Actually, Richard had an idea that seemed absolutely hilarious to him. "Maya, come here. I want to show you something. Maya looked at her mother, who nodded nervously, and approached the desk with small but determined steps. Despite her youth, there was something in her eyes that Richard had never seen in Eleanor's eyes. A spark of defiance that hadn't been completely crushed by poverty and circumstances. Look at this document. Richard placed the ancient papers before her eyes, as if they were a dirty rag. The 5 smartest translators in the city can't read this. They're university doctors, professors with international degrees, language specialists who have studied 4 decades. Maya looked at the papers with genuine curiosity. Her eyes moved across the strange characters, the words in languages that seemed to dance between different writing systems. Do you know what this means? Richard asked with a mocking smile that spread across his entire face. It was a rhetorical question, a cruel joke, designed to demonstrate the obvious inferiority of this poor girl before educated academics. To his surprise, Maya didn't immediately look away. Instead, she studied the document with an intensity that was disconcerting in someone so young. No, sir, she finally responded in a low voice. Of course not. Richard roared with laughter, banging on the desk with both hands. A 12-year-old girl from a janitor's family, while doctors with 30 years of experience also can't. He turned to Eleanor, his voice becoming even more venomous. Do you understand the irony, Eleanor? You clean the bathrooms of men who are infinitely more intelligent than you and your daughter will end up doing exactly the same thing, because intelligence is inherited. Eleanor gritted her teeth, trying to contain the tears of humiliation that threatened to spill. For 7 years, she had endured comments like these. She had developed emotional armor to protect herself from the cruelty of men like Richard. But seeing her daughter being humiliated this way was different. It was a pain that cut deeper than any personal insult. Maya observed the entire scene with an expression that was gradually changing. The initial confusion was being replaced by something more powerful, indignation. Not for herself, but for her mother, who worked 14 hours a day to maintain her 3 children, who never complained, who always found a way to put food on the table and school supplies in their backpacks. But enough games. Richard returned to his seat, clearly enjoying every second of his cruelty show. Eleanor, you can start cleaning, and Maya, sit there in silence while the important adults work. Excuse me, sir. Maya's clear and firm voice cut through the air like a sharp knife. Richard turned, surprised that the girl dared to interrupt. His expression was a mixture of amusement and irritation. What do you want, girl? Going to defend Mommy? Maya walked slowly through the office, her steps resonating on the marble with a determination that surprised everyone in the room. When she reached Richard, she looked directly into the eyes of an adult who was trying to intimidate her. Sir, she said with a calm that contrasted dramatically with her age. You said that the city's best translators can't read that document. Richard blinked, confused by the confidence in this child's voice, who should be trembling with fear. That's right. So what? And can you read it? The question hit Richard like an unexpected slap. Throughout his entire life, he had used his wealth and position to intimidate others, but he had never claimed to have specific academic knowledge. His fortune came from smart investments and cruel business decisions, not from higher education. That's not the point, Richard stammered, feeling for the first time in years that he was losing control of a conversation. So you also can't read it, Maya declared with simple but devastating logic. That makes you less intelligent than the doctors who also can't, Eleanor gasped. In 12 years of life, she had never seen her daughter challenge an adult this way, and she certainly had never seen anyone, child or adult, put Richard Sterling in such an uncomfortable position with a simple question. Richard felt his face reddening, a mixture of anger and something he hadn't experienced in decades, shame. This 12-year-old girl had just exposed the fundamental hypocrisy in his logic with the brutal clarity of innocence. That's completely different, he roared, his voice increasing in volume to compensate for the weakness of his argument. I'm a successful businessman. I'm worth almost $4.2 billion. But does that make you more intelligent? Maya asked with the same unshakable calm. My teacher says that intelligence isn't measured by how much money you have, but by what you know and how you treat others. The silence that followed was so profound you could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Richard found himself completely disarmed by the simple but impeccable logic of a 12-year-old girl who had just destroyed his central argument with the precision of a surgeon. Eleanor looked at her daughter with a mixture of terror and pride. Terror because she knew that Richard Sterling had the power to destroy their lives with a single phone call. Pride because for the first time she was seeing her daughter defend herself and, by extension, defending their family's dignity. Besides, Maya continued, her voice getting stronger with each word, you said I couldn't read the document because I'm a janitor's daughter, but you never asked me what languages I speak. Richard felt a strange chill running down his spine. There was something in the way Maya had pronounced those last words that gave him a bad feeling. What languages do you speak? He asked, though he was no longer sure he wanted to hear the answer. Maya looked directly into his eyes, with a confidence that seemed impossible in someone so young. I speak native English, advanced Spanish, fluent French, intermediate Italian, basic German, conversational Mandarin, and beginner Russian. The list came from her lips like a powerful sequence, each language pronounced with a precision that made Richard's jaw slowly drop. That's 7 languages, Maya added with a small but triumphant smile. How many do you speak? The question hung in the air like a bomb about to explode. Eleanor had been paralyzed, not only by the shock of hearing her daughter enumerate languages she didn't even know she knew, but by the realization that the power dynamic in the room had just completely changed. Richard opened and closed his mouth several times like a fish out of water. For 52 years, he had used his wealth as a shield and a sword, intimidating others with his financial success. He had never found himself in a situation where a 12-year-old girl had intellectually surpassed him in public. And that single quote says ... How ... double quotes he stammered, all his arrogance evaporating. Would you like me to try reading your document? Maya asked with a courtesy that somehow made the offer even more devastating. Maybe I can help where the doctors couldn't. And at that moment, Richard Sterling realized he had made the gravest mistake of his life. He had completely underestimated the wrong person and was about to discover that some humiliations you can't buy your way out of. Little Maya Vasquez was about to change his world forever. The silence that followed Maya's question was so dense it seemed to have physical weight. Richard Sterling, the most powerful man in New York, found himself completely paralyzed by a 12-year-old girl who had just shattered his logic with the brutal simplicity of truth. His hands trembled slightly as he processed what he had just heard. 7 languages. A girl who supposedly should be grateful for the crumbs of public education had declared she spoke 7 languages, more than Richard could learn in his entire lifetime, even with all his billions. That's impossible, Richard finally stammered, his voice sounding strangely weak in the room he had designed specifically to intimidate. Where did you learn all of this? Maya looked at him with an expression that was a mixture of patience and determination, as if she were explaining something obvious to an adult who hadn't been paying attention. At the public library, Mr. Sterling, they have free language programs every day after school. There are also videos on the internet, free apps, and books that anyone can borrow if they're curious enough to learn. Each word was like a gentle but devastating slap. Richard realized that while he had been spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on artwork that no one saw, on exclusive restaurants where he flaunted his wealth, and on watches that cost more than Eleanor's annual salary, this girl had been quietly building knowledge that he could never buy. Eleanor looked at her daughter with a mixture of amazement and terror. She had known Maya was intelligent, that she always brought good grades home, that she spent hours at the library, but she had never imagined the true extent of what her daughter had been learning in silence. The programs are run by immigrants who live in the city, Maya continued with the same unbreakable calm. Mrs. Chen teaches me Mandarin on Tuesdays. Ahmed helps me with Arabic on Thursdays. Isabella teaches me Italian on Saturdays. They're people who, like my mother, have simple jobs but know incredible things. Richard felt nauseous. This girl had just described a learning network he had never known existed, a community of people he had automatically dismissed as inferior, but who apparently possessed knowledge that rivaled that of university professors. But that doesn't mean read a complex academic document, Richard said, desperately clinging to any fragment of superiority he could maintain. Speaking basic languages isn't the same as understanding specialized ancient texts. You're right, Maya nodded, surprising him. That's why I also study in the classical languages section of the Columbia University Library on weekends. The librarians let me in because I always return books on time and never make noise. Richard's jaw dropped completely. The university library on Saturday mornings is almost empty. I've been reading about comparative linguistics, ancient writing systems, and language evolution for the past 2 years. It's fascinating how languages connect to each other through history. Richard collapsed into his chair as if someone had removed all the bones from his body. This 12-year-old girl hadn't just been learning modern languages. She had been independently studying subjects that normally required graduate degrees to understand fully. 2 years, Richard whispered, his voice barely audible. I started when I was 10. My mother was working double shifts to pay for us to go to private school, but then she lost that extra job. When I went back to public school, I had a lot of free time because the classes were easier. So I decided to use that time to learn things that really interested me. Each word was like a direct hammer blow to Richard's ego. He realized that while he had been bragging about the higher education his money could buy, this girl was obtaining an education that was infinitely more impressive through pure intellectual curiosity and determination. Show me, Richard said suddenly, his voice hoarse. If you really know all this, show me. Maya looked at her mother, who nodded nervously, and approached the desk where the mysterious document that had defeated the 5 most prestigious translators in the city lay. She picked up the papers with steady hands and studied them for a moment that felt like an eternity. Richard could see her eyes moving across the strange characters, recognizing patterns, making connections that university specialists had missed. It's interesting, Maya murmured, more to herself than to the others. It's not a single language. It's a combination of several writing systems organized in thematic layers. Richard felt as if the entire world was turning upside down. What does that mean? The document is structured like a linguistic puzzle. Each paragraph is written in a different language, but all the paragraphs speak about the same theme from different cultural perspectives. It's as if someone wanted to preserve the same wisdom in multiple linguistic traditions. Elena approached slowly, fascinated despite her terror. She had never seen her daughter speak with this academic authority, had never witnessed the real scope of her intelligence. Can you read it? Elena asked in a whisper. Maya looked up from the document and stared directly at Richard. Would you like me to try, Mr. Sterling? Richard felt as if he was standing on the edge of a precipice. Part of him wanted to say no. He wanted to maintain the illusion that this girl was just a child who had gotten lucky with some memorized phrases. But another part of him, a part that had been buried under decades of arrogance, was genuinely curious to know what this extraordinary creature would say. Yes, he murmured, try. Maya turned her attention to the document and began to read. But what came from her mouth made Richard completely freeze. Because Maya Vasquez, the 12-year-old daughter of a janitor, began to read the first paragraph in perfect classical Mandarin. Her pronunciation was impeccable, with tones that indicated not just knowledge of the language, but deep understanding of its cultural nuances. The words flowed from her lips like ancient music, loaded with meaning and authority that seemed impossible in someone so young. Richard's mouth had fallen open, his mocking expression transforming into one of absolute shock he would never forget. For 52 years, he had operated under the belief that real education, true intelligence, was only available to those who could pay for it. This girl had just completely shattered that belief, but Maya didn't stop there. When she finished the first paragraph in Mandarin, without even pausing, she moved to the second paragraph and began reading in classical Arabic with the same supernatural fluency. The words came from her mouth with a musicality that made Richard feel as if he were witnessing something impossible. This wasn't a girl reciting memorized phrases. This was a genuine scholar who understood not just the words, but the cultural and historical contexts behind each expression. Elena brought her hands to her heart, tears beginning to form in her eyes. Her daughter, her little Maya, who helped wash dishes after dinner and did her homework at the kitchen table under a dim lamp, was demonstrating a level of knowledge that rivaled university professors. Maya continued with the third paragraph, this time speaking what sounded like ancient Italian. Richard had no idea what she was saying, but he could hear the reverence in her voice, as if she understood not just the words, but the spiritual and philosophical weight they carried. With each language Maya mastered perfectly, Richard's humiliation grew exponentially. He realized that for decades he had been bragging about his superior education in front of employees like Elena, when in reality Elena's daughter knew more about practically any academic subject than he ever would. His world of certainties was crumbling word by word, language by language. Maya read the fourth paragraph in what sounded like Russian, her voice acquiring a different quality that indicated deep respect for the tradition she was representing. Then the fifth paragraph in German, followed by the sixth in French. When she finally finished reading, Maya looked up from the document and stared directly at Richard. For the first time in the history of his interactions with service employees, there was no submission in the eyes looking at him. There was something he had never seen directed at him, a deep, ancient, wise intelligence that had been hidden all this time behind economic poverty and youth. "Would you like me to translate the complete meaning, Mr. Sterling?" Maya asked with a calm that contrasted dramatically with the tremor that had invaded everyone present. Richard tried to speak, but only a muffled sound came from his throat. His face had gone from the red of anger to the white of absolute shock. His hands were shaking, and he could feel cold sweat running down his back despite the office air conditioning. Elena approached her daughter with tears streaming down her cheeks. "Maya, where did you learn all this?" Maya smiled for the first time since this entire situation had begun, but it was a smile that had a wisdom that seemed impossible in someone her age. "Mom," she responded with a voice that suddenly had a dignity Richard had never heard before in his office. "You always told me that education was the only thing no one could take away from me, so I decided to take all the education I could find. It didn't matter if I had to get it from public libraries." Those words were like a dagger directly to Richard's heart. He realized this girl had achieved more with free resources and personal determination than he had achieved with millions of dollars and elite connections. Richard finally found his voice, though it sounded strangled and weak. What does the document say?" Maya placed the document on the marble table with reverential care, as if it were a precious treasure. Her movements were suddenly different. She no longer had the hunched posture of a girl trying to be invisible, but the erect posture of someone who knew her own intellectual worth. "The document speaks about the true nature of wisdom and wealth," Maya began, her voice clear and firm. "It says that true wisdom doesn't dwell in golden palaces, but in humble hearts, that real wealth isn't counted in coins, but in the capacity to see dignity in every soul." Each word was like an arrow directed straight at Richard's soul. He realized the document wasn't just a linguistic puzzle, it was a mirror that reflected exactly what he had become and what he had lost in the process. "It says that he who believes himself superior because of his possessions is the poorest of all men, because he has lost the ability to recognize the light in others." Maya continued, looking directly at Richard as she spoke. "What else?" Richard whispered, though part of him no longer wanted to hear the answer. "That true power doesn't come from the ability to humiliate others, but from the capacity to elevate them, and that when a powerful person discovers they have been blind to the wisdom surrounding them, that is the moment of their true awakening, or their eternal condemnation." The room fell into absolute silence when Maya finished. Richard realized he had not only been humiliated by a 12-year-old girl, he had been judged by her and found lacking in every aspect that truly mattered. He had come face to face with his own soul and didn't like what he saw at all. The silence that followed Maya's words was so profound that Richard could hear his own heartbeat. echoing like war drums in his ears. For the first time in 52 years of life, he found himself completely without words, without defenses, without the armor of arrogance he had carefully built over decades. His hands trembled as he gripped the edge of his marble table, trying to find something solid in a world that had suddenly become liquid and unstable. The girl standing before him was no longer simply the daughter of a cleaning employee. She was a brutal mirror that reflected everything he had lost, everything he had never been, and everything he could never buy with his $4.2 billion. Who are you really? Richard whispered, his voice barely audible in the room he had designed to intimidate, but now felt like a prison of his own construction. Maya looked at him with an expression that was a mixture of compassion and wisdom that seemed impossible in a 12-year-old. I'm exactly who you've always seen, Mr. Sterling. I'm Maya Vasquez, daughter of Elena Vasquez, student at Jefferson Elementary School, and someone who believes all people deserve to be treated with dignity. Each word was like a drop of acid falling on Richard's soul. He realized that throughout his entire life he had been confusing external labels with people's real worth. He had judged Elena by her cleaning uniform, never wondering what kind of mother could raise such an extraordinary daughter. He had assumed that economic poverty equaled intellectual poverty, when evidence to the contrary had been before him for years. Elena approached her daughter and placed a protective hand on her shoulder. Maya, it's time for us to go, she murmured softly, clearly worried about the possible consequences of what had just happened. No, Richard said suddenly, his voice rough with emotion. Please, don't leave. Mother and daughter looked at him with surprise. For 7 years, Richard had never said please to Elena. He had never shown the slightest consideration for her schedules, her needs, or her basic humanity. I need to understand, Richard continued, struggling with words he had never spoken before. How is it possible? How can a 12-year-old girl know more than I do about everything? Maya exchanged a look with her mother, who nodded almost imperceptibly and approached the chair in front of Richard's desk. For the first time in the history of that room, someone who wasn't a millionaire sat as an equal before the empire's owner. I don't know more than you about everything, Mr. Sterling, Maya responded with brutal honesty. You know about business, about making money, about running companies. Those are skills I don't have, but she continued, and Richard could feel a devastating but coming. But you never learned about the things that really matter. You never learned about respect, about humility, about seeing humanity in others. And those are the most important lessons of all. Richard felt as if each word were a punch directly to his stomach. And you did learn them, he asked, his voice coming out lower than normal. My mother taught me, Maya responded simply, looking at Elena with genuine love. She works 14 hours a day to give my siblings and me a dignified life. She never complains, never speaks badly of people who treat her unfairly. She always finds time to help me with homework, even when she's exhausted. Elena felt tears forming in her eyes as she heard her daughter describe her sacrifices with such clarity and appreciation. Do you know what my mother taught me that's worth more than all your millions? Maya asked, looking directly at Richard. Richard shook his head, unable to speak. She taught me that true wealth lies in the capacity to make others feel valuable. She taught me that intelligence without kindness is simply educated cruelty. And she taught me that no matter how little you have materially, you can always choose to treat others with dignity. Each lesson was like a gentle but devastating slap. Richard realized that Elena, whom he had treated as if she were invisible for 7 years, had been raising a philosopher in her humble home, while he had been accumulating expensive objects in his empty mansion. But I worked my entire life to get where I am, Richard protested weakly, clinging to the last pieces of his self-image. And that's admirable, Maya agreed, surprising him with her frankness. But the question is, what did you build it for? To help others? To make the world a better place? Or just to feel superior to people like my mother? The question hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Richard opened his mouth to defend himself, but realized he didn't have an answer that wouldn't make him look like the selfish monster he probably was. I don't know, he finally admitted, his voice breaking with the most honest admission he had made in decades. "That's the difference between us, Mr. Sterling," Maya said gently. "You never asked yourself why you were building your empire. I always ask myself why I'm learning each new language, reading each new book, studying each new subject. And what's your answer? Because I want to understand the world well enough to help change it. Because I believe education is a tool for justice, not for arrogance. And because I want to honor the sacrifices my mother made by giving purpose to everything I've learned." Richard felt something strange moving in his chest, something he hadn't experienced in years. It was a mixture of deep shame and something that could be admiration, respect. He wasn't sure, but he knew it was the first time in decades he felt he was in the presence of someone genuinely superior to him. Not in money or power, but in the things that truly mattered. "What do I do now?" he asked, surprising himself with the genuine vulnerability in his own voice. Maya studied him for a long moment, as if evaluating whether the question was sincere or simply another manipulation. Apparently, she decided it was genuine. "First," she said, "you need to apologize to my mother, not just for today, but for 7 years of treating her as if she were invisible." Richard looked at Elena, who had been observing the entire conversation with a mixture of terror and fascination. For 7 years, she had simply been the cleaning woman to him. He had never known her full name, never asked about her family, never even acknowledged her basic humanity. "Elena," he began, his voice trembling, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry for all these years of treating you as if you weren't a real person. I'm sorry for never asking about your life, for never recognizing that you have a family, dreams, hopes. And I'm especially sorry for humiliating you in front of your daughter today." Elena gasped. In 7 years of work, Richard had never pronounced her name, much less apologized for anything. "But an apology isn't enough," Maya continued relentlessly. "Words are easy. Real changes require actions." "What kind of actions?" "You need to change how you treat all your employees. You need to learn their names, understand their lives, recognize their humanity. You need to use your wealth to elevate others instead of humiliating them." "But I don't know how to do that," Richard admitted, feeling like a lost child. "Then learn," Maya responded with the same determination. She had used to learn 7 languages. "My mother can teach you. She knows more about real leadership than all the business books you've read." Richard looked at Elena with new eyes. For the first time in 7 years, he really saw her. He saw a woman who had raised an extraordinary daughter while working exhausting jobs. He saw someone who had maintained her dignity despite years of humiliation. He saw a real leader who had been under his nose all this time. "Elena," he said softly, "would you help me? Would you teach me how to be better?" Elena looked at him for a long moment, evaluating whether this transformation was genuine or temporary. Finally, she nodded slowly. "But there are conditions," Maya intervened. "Whatever you want," Richard responded immediately. "First, my mother needs a real job, with a dignified salary and respect. No more cleaning bathrooms for a man who can afford 100 employees." "Agreed." "Second, you're going to create a scholarship program for children like me, intelligent children from working families who deserve real opportunities." "Agreed." "Third, you're going to learn at least 1 new language to understand what it feels like to be in a student's shoes again." Richard blinked, surprised by this condition. "What language?" Maya smiled for the first time since this entire situation had begun. "I'll teach you Mandarin on Tuesday evenings after work at the public library." The idea of Richard Sterling, one of the richest men in New York, learning languages at a public library was so revolutionary it seemed almost impossible. But as he looked at this extraordinary girl and her resilient mother, he realized that perhaps this was exactly the kind of impossible he needed in his life. "Do we have a deal?" Maya asked, extending her small but firm hand. Richard looked at the girl's hand for a moment, knowing that shaking it would fundamentally change who he was as a person. Then, for the first time in decades, he made a decision based not on money or power, but on the hope of becoming someone worthy of respect. He shook Maya's hand firmly. "We have a deal," he said, And for the first time in years, I feel like I've done something truly important. The change had begun. The man who had entered that room as an arrogant tyrant was leaving as someone willing to learn. And all because a 12-year-old girl had the courage to show that true education isn't bought, it's earned. That true wealth isn't accumulated, it's shared. And that true greatness isn't imposed, it's inspired. 3 days later, Richard Sterling found himself doing something he had never imagined in his entire life, waiting nervously in the lobby of the New York Public Library, a building he had passed for decades, without even noticing it. His hands were sweating as he held a basic college notebook he had bought at a neighborhood stationery store, feeling like a first-day student waiting to meet his most intimidating teacher. The contrast couldn't have been more dramatic. For 52 years, Richard had operated from crystal towers, marble offices, and boardrooms where each object cost more than a middle-class family's annual salary. Now he stood in a public space, surrounded by children doing homework, elderly people reading newspapers, and mothers carrying babies while looking for books. It was a completely different world from his, a world that existed parallel to his bubble of privilege, without him ever having noticed it. "Mr. Sterling," a familiar voice pulled him from his anxious reflections. He turned to see Maya walking toward him with a school backpack full of books and a smile that was professional but warm. She no longer wore the worn school uniform she had worn during their first encounter, but casual weekend clothes that, while clearly not expensive, were impeccable and carefully coordinated. "Maya," Richard responded, surprising himself with how natural it sounded to pronounce her name with genuine respect. "Thank you for doing this. Are you ready for your first lesson?" Maya asked, gesturing toward the study tables filled with students of all ages. "Honestly, I'm terrified," Richard admitted, a confession that would have been unthinkable a week before. "I haven't been a student since college, and that was 30 years ago." Maya guided him to the language section, an area Richard had never known existed. The walls were covered with posters of alphabets in different languages, world maps marking linguistic families, and schedules of free classes in dozens of different languages. "All of this is free?" Richard asked with genuine incredulity. "Completely free," Maya responded, while organizing basic Mandarin materials on the table. "The city believes education should be accessible to everyone, not just those who can pay for it." The statement hit Richard like a gentle slap. For decades he had assumed that quality education was a privilege you bought, when apparently it had been available a few blocks from his office all this time. "Let's start with the basics," Maya announced, opening a worn but well-cared-for textbook. "The 4 tones of Mandarin are fundamental. Without them, a word can mean completely different things." For the next hour, Richard experienced something he hadn't felt in decades, the absolute humility of being completely ignorant about a subject. Maya was a patient but demanding teacher, correcting his pronunciation with the same academic authority she had demonstrated when translating the mysterious document. "MD, Ma, Ma." Richard tried to repeat the tones, his voice sounding clumsy and rough compared to Maya's musical fluency. "Better," Maya encouraged him over his 10th attempt. "Remember, the first tone is high and flat, as if you were singing a sustained note." Richard realized he was sweating from the mental effort of something this 12-year-old girl mastered effortlessly. It was a lesson in humility deeper than any financial loss he had ever experienced. "Can I ask you something?" Richard said during a break. "Of course. How can you teach with such patience someone who treated you so badly?" Maya considered the question carefully before responding. "Because I believe in second chances, and because teaching is a way of honoring all the teachers who were patient with me. But aren't you angry? Don't you feel resentment?" "I was angry," Maya admitted honestly, "very angry. But my mother taught me that anger is like holding a burning coal with the intention of throwing it at someone else. In the end, you're the only one who gets burned." The wisdom of these words coming from someone who could be his granddaughter struck Richard deeply. He realized he had been holding burning coals of arrogance and contempt for decades, burning himself without realizing it. "Let's continue," he said, determined to honor his young teacher's patience with genuine effort. As he progressed clumsily through basic Mandarin characters, Richard became aware of his surroundings. At the next table, an elderly woman was helping a child with math. At another, a group of teenagers studied silently for exams. In the computer section, adults learned basic digital skills. It was a microcosm of learning and growth that had existed parallel to his world of luxury, without him ever noticing it. He realized he had been living in a bubble so dense he had completely lost sight of the humanity surrounding him. "Maya," Richard said softly, "could I meet some of your other teachers?" Maya's eyes lit up. "Really? You'd like to?" "I'd love to." Maya guided him through the library, introducing him to an extraordinary community of volunteer educators who had been functioning under his nose for years. He met Ahmed, a Syrian refugee who taught Arabic while working as a taxi driver. Mrs. Chen, a retiree who had been a professor in Beijing before emigrating. Isabella, a housekeeper who taught Italian on weekends. Each introduction was like a gentle punch to his previous worldview. These people he would have automatically looked down upon, service jobs, turned out to be brilliant educators with extraordinary stories of resilience and knowledge. Dr. Ahmed, Richard said, using the title Maya, told him was appropriate. "Maya tells me you teach classical Arabic." Ahmed smiled warmly. "It's an honor to keep the language alive. In my country, was a university professor of literature. Here I drive taxi, but languages live in the heart." Richard felt a pang of shame remembering how many times he had taken taxis driven by men like Ahmed, never wondering about their previous lives, their losses, their silent contributions to the community. Could you teach me some Arabic too?" he asked timidly. "It would be an honor," Ahmed responded, and Richard could see tears forming in his eyes. "It's been a long time since someone asked me to teach for the simple love of knowledge." When he finally finished his first Mandarin lesson, Richard felt physically and mentally exhausted, but also strangely energized. For decades, he had assumed he was done learning, that his education was complete. Discovering he could still struggle with new concepts, still feel the satisfaction of mastering something difficult, was an unexpected revelation. "Same time next week?" Maya asked while packing her materials. "Absolutely," Richard responded without hesitation. "And Maya, thank you, not just for the language lesson, but for showing me a world I was ignoring." "You weren't ignoring it, Richard," Maya corrected gently. "You just didn't know it existed. Now that you know, you can choose what to do with that knowledge." As Richard drove back to his mansion that night, his thoughts were completely occupied by the day's lessons. Not just the Mandarin lessons, but the deeper lessons about community, humility, and the wealth of knowledge that existed in places he had never thought to look. The next day, Richard did something that surprised his entire executive team. He called an emergency meeting, not to discuss profits or expansion, but to talk about corporate social responsibility. "I want us to establish a full scholarship program for students from working families," he announced to his surprised executives. "And I want us to sponsor language programs in public libraries throughout the city." "What's the return on investment?" asked his CFO with evident confusion. "The return is that we live in a better society," Richard responded, surprising himself with the conviction in his voice. "The return is that we stop wasting human talent due to accidents of birth." His executives exchanged worried looks, clearly thinking their boss had lost his sanity. But Richard no longer cared what the men who had been accomplices to his previous arrogance thought. That same week, he fulfilled another of his promises. Elena Vasquez was officially hired as Director of Human Development with a salary that was 10 times what she had been earning as a cleaning employee. Her first task would be to work with Richard to identify and develop hidden talent among all company employees. "Elena," Richard told her during their first official meeting, "I want you to teach me everything Maya says. You know about real leadership." Elena, still adjusting to her new office and new status, looked at him with a mixture of determination and nervousness. "Mr. Sterling, real leadership isn't having power over others. It's having power to elevate others. Teach me," Richard said simply. And so began an education worth more than all the university degrees and business MBAs that money could buy. An education about humanity, humility, and the responsibility that comes with real privilege. For the first time in decades, Richard Sterling was learning the lessons that truly mattered, discovering that real growth didn't come from accumulating more, but from becoming more. Not from having more power, but from using the power you have to elevate others. 6 weeks later, Richard Sterling found himself facing something he hadn't anticipated, a silent but determined rebellion from his closest social circle. The exclusive Manhattan Business Club, where he had lunched every Friday for the past 15 years, had suddenly become hostile territory. "Richard, we need to talk," declared William Blackstone, oil magnate and one of his oldest golf partners, as he sat heavily across from him in the club's private dining room. His eyes had the hardness of someone who had come to perform an intervention. "Of course, William. What do you want to discuss?" Richard responded, though he could perfectly intuit where the conversation was heading. "Your recent ... Strange behavior," William began, gesturing with his $3,000 wine glass. "The entire city's talking. They say you're learning languages at public libraries, that you promoted a janitor to an executive position, that you're spending millions on scholarships for poor children." "All of that is true," Richard confirmed quietly, continuing with his lunch, if they were discussing the weather. "You've lost your mind," interrupted Charles Worthington, pharmaceutical heir, his voice loaded with incredulity. "A janitor as an executive, you learning in public libraries with common people." Richard felt a familiar pang of irritation, but this time it wasn't directed at those challenging him, but at his own past attitudes reflected in his former friends. "Elena Vasquez is more intelligent and has better leadership skills than most executives I've known," Richard responded calmly. "And yes, I'm learning Mandarin and Arabic with extraordinary teachers who happen to work as taxi drivers and housekeepers." "Extraordinary teachers who work as taxi drivers." William laughed cruelly. "Richard, you're completely losing touch with reality. Those people aren't real teachers. They're failures who couldn't maintain jobs in their own countries." The statement hit Richard like a slap. It was exactly the kind of comment he himself would have made 6 weeks before, and now it seemed not only ignorant but cruelly inhumane. "William, Dr. Ahmed had a chair in Arabic literature at Damascus University before the war destroyed his country," Richard responded, his voice acquiring a tone his friends rarely heard. "Mrs. Chen was director of the linguistics department in Beijing before emigrating to reunite with her family. They're not failures, they're brilliant refugees and immigrants who are rebuilding their lives. And since when does that matter to you?" Charles asked with evident contempt. 4 years you mocked those same people. What changed?" Richard considered the question carefully. What had really changed? Was it just the shock of being humiliated by Maya, or had it been something deeper? "I realized I was living in a bubble so dense I had completely lost sight of what it means to be human," Richard responded honestly. "I realized I had confused financial success with moral superiority, and that I was wasting opportunities to meet extraordinary people because of stupid prejudices." "That's ridiculous," interrupted Patrick Vanderberg, telecommunications magnate, who had arrived late to the conversation but had heard enough to catch up. "Richard, we all know you're going through some kind of crisis. Maybe you should consider taking a vacation, seeing a psychiatrist, and not having a crisis," Richard interrupted firmly. "For the first time in decades, I'm completely sane. You're the ones living in a fantasy where money makes you better people." The silence that followed was tense and hostile. Richard could see he had crossed a line with his former friends, who had come expecting him to recognize his mistake and return to the flock of shared arrogance. "Look, Richard," William leaned forward, his voice becoming threatening. "I don't know what game you're playing, but it's affecting all of us. Other business people are starting to question our circle. They're wondering if we've all gone soft. And that worries you?" Richard asked with genuine curiosity. "Of course it worries me. Our power comes from sticking together, from presenting a united front. When one of us starts acting like a social activist, it weakens everyone. Richard realized something fundamental at that moment. His former friends weren't worried about his mental well-being or business success. They were worried because his transformation threatened the system of privilege from which they all benefited. "Do you know what I've learned these 6 weeks?" Richard asked, standing up slowly. "I've learned that true power doesn't come from the ability to exclude others, but from the capacity to elevate them." "That's progressive nonsense," Charles spat. "Real power comes from competition, from superiority, from keeping the competition down." "And how's that working for you?" Richard asked. "Are you happy? Do you feel fulfilled? Can you look in the mirror and feel proud of who you are as people?" The questions hung in the air like bombs waiting to explode. Richard could see in his former friends' faces that he had touched something uncomfortable, something they preferred not to examine. "Happiness is a luxury," Patrick responded defensively. "We focus on real success." "And what is real success?" Richard pressed. "Numbers in a bank account, the ability to humiliate employees, living in a bubble where you never have to confront your own humanity." "You're talking like an idiot." William stood up abruptly, clearly frustrated. "Richard, we're giving you 1 week to reconsider this phase. After that, you'll have to choose between keeping your place in this circle or continuing with this social justice nonsense." "I don't need a week," Richard responded immediately. "I choose to continue being a decent person. If that means losing your approval, so be it." The silence that followed was absolute. For 15 years, these men had been his closest social circle, his validators, his accomplices in mutual arrogance. Losing their approval would have been unthinkable 6 weeks before. "Fine," William said finally, picking up his jacket. "But when this kindness experiment fails, when you realize the real world doesn't work with hugs and language lessons, don't come to us asking to be accepted back." "I won't," Richard promised, "because I've discovered something you apparently never experienced. I found a social circle based on mutual respect, personal growth, and genuine contribution to others' well-being, and it happens to be infinitely more satisfying than this." As his former friends left the dining room with expressions of disgust, Richard felt strangely relieved. For years he had maintained these friendships out of habit and social convenience, without realizing how toxic they had been for his development as a person. That same afternoon, Richard kept his weekly session at the public library. While practicing Chinese characters with Maya, he told her about his confrontation with his former friends. "Do you feel bad about losing those friendships?" Maya asked with genuine curiosity. Surprisingly, "No," Richard admitted. "I feel like I've released a weight I'd been carrying 4 years without realizing it." "That's normal," commented Ahmed, who had joined their study session. "When we start growing as people, sometimes we have to leave behind relationships that no longer serve us." "But don't you feel lonely sometimes?" Richard asked. "Yes," Mrs. Chen said from the next table. "But then we discover there's a whole world of authentic people waiting to meet us. We just couldn't see them before because we were surrounded by mirrors that reflected our worst version." The words resonated deeply with Richard. He realized he had been surrounded by people who reflected and validated his worst qualities, while now he was surrounded by people who inspired him to be better. "Besides," Maya added with a smile, "now you have real friends. Friends who value you for who you're trying to become, not for how much money you have." Richard looked around the study table. Maya with her impossible wisdom, Ahmed with his unshakable dignity, Mrs. Chen with her infinite patience, and he realized Maya was right. He had gained something much more valuable than what he had lost. "You're right," he said finally. "And do you know what the best part is?" "What?" they asked in unison. "For the first time in decades, when I look in the mirror, I like the person I see looking back." It was the simplest and most profound truth he had spoken in his entire life. The transformation was really happening, cell by cell, thought by thought, action by action. And while he had lost the respect of his former social circle, he had gained something infinitely more precious, respect for himself. That night, as he drove home, Richard reflected on the extraordinary journey he had traveled. He had started as an arrogant tyrant, convinced of his superiority, and was transforming into someone who finally understood that true greatness doesn't come from being above others, but from standing beside them. The most important lesson hadn't come from business books or expensive consultants, but from a 12-year-old girl who had the courage to show a powerful man that he had been measuring success with completely wrong metrics. That true wealth isn't accumulated, it's shared. That true intelligence isn't imposed, it's offered. And that true leadership doesn't dominate, but serves. The transformation was far from complete, but the foundations had been laid. And for the first time in his adult life, Richard Sterling felt he was on the right path. 1 year later, Richard Sterling stood in the same place where his transformation had begun, the 35th floor boardroom of his corporate tower. But it was no longer the same room, just as he was no longer the same man. The black marble walls had been replaced with large windows that filled the space with natural light. The expensive artwork had given way to photographs of beneficiaries from his educational programs, and where there had once been an intimidating marble desk, there was now a round wooden table where he met weekly with Eleanor, Maya, and other community leaders to plan new initiatives. This morning was special. He had called a press conference to announce something that would have been unthinkable a year before: the creation of the Mayor Vasquez Foundation for Human Dignity, endowed with $800 million, nearly half his personal fortune, dedicated to expanding educational programs throughout America. Mr. Sterling, Eleanor's professional voice pulled him from his reflections as she reviewed the foundation's final documents. The journalists have arrived. The representatives from the 25 universities committed to participating in the national program, also here. Eleanor Vasquez had transformed as much as Richard during these months. She no longer wore the navy blue cleaning uniform, but elegant professional suits that reflected her new position as the foundation's executive director. But more than her external appearance, what had changed was her posture. She no longer walked with the lowered head of someone expecting to be invisible, but with the confidence of someone who knows their ideas are valued and respected. "And Maya?" Richard asked, though he knew she would never miss such an important event. "She's in the auditorium reviewing her presentation. She's been working on it 4 weeks." Eleanor smiled. "I think she's going to surprise everyone." As they walked to the auditorium, Richard reflected on the extraordinary year that had passed. The changes hadn't been just in his personal life, but in the entire structure of his company and its impact on the community. Sterling Technologies had been recognized as the most innovative company in corporate social responsibility in America. Employee turnover had dropped to practically zero. Productivity had increased 45%, and most importantly, it had become the most desired employer in the country, not for high salaries, but for the culture of respect and personal growth he had cultivated. "Mr. Sterling," a familiar voice stopped him in the hallway. It was Sofia Rodriguez, the first scholarship recipient to graduate from the program, who now worked as an engineer at his company while finishing a master's in public administration. "Sofia, how wonderful to see you here." Richard greeted her with genuine affection. "How are your studies going?" "Incredibly well, thanks to you. But I wanted to tell you something before the conference." Sofia paused, clearly emotional. "Yesterday, I received a letter from my younger sister. She's in her first year of high school and wrote to tell me she wants to be like you when she grows up." Richard felt a lump in his throat. "Like me, yes. She says she wants to be someone who uses their success to help others succeed. She also says you taught her that the truly rich are those who enrich others." The profound simplicity of those words, filtered through an adolescent's perspective, struck Richard more than any corporate recognition he had received. He realized the true indicator of his transformation wasn't newspaper, articles, or awards, but the kind of example he was setting for the next generation. When they entered the auditorium, Richard was breathless at what he saw. It wasn't just the presence of national and international journalists or the university representatives from across the country. It was the quality of the audience. Hundreds of students from educational programs, parents from working families, volunteer teachers from libraries, his company employees, refugees and immigrants who had found new opportunities, and community leaders who had emerged from the movement that had begun with a simple lesson in humility. Dr. Ahmed. Richard greeted the Syrian refugee, who now directed language programs in 23 city libraries. How does it feel to see all this? Like witnessing the birth of something that will change the world, Ahmed responded with tears in his eyes. A year ago I was a taxi driver with broken dreams. Today I'm coordinator of a program that has taught languages to more than 3,000 people. This is what a real second chance means. And you gave second chances to thousands of people. Mrs. Chen intervened, who had developed a Mandarin curriculum now used in universities across 4 states. Including yourself, Richard realized a profound truth in those words. His transformation had essentially been a second chance to be the person he had always had the potential to be, but who had been buried under decades of arrogance and emotional disconnection. Finally, the moment for the official conference arrived. Richard approached the podium, but before beginning, he did something that surprised everyone. He invited Maya to join him on stage. Maya Vasquez, now 13 years old, had grown not just physically, but in presence and moral authority. She wore an elegant navy blue dress, not expensive, but chosen with the same care that characterized everything she did. Her eyes had the same penetrating intelligence that had disconcerted Richard a year before, but now they also had the confidence of someone who had seen their ideas transform to tangible reality. Ladies and gentlemen, Richard began, his voice clear, but loaded with genuine emotion. Exactly 1 year ago, I stood in this same room convinced I was one of the most successful men in America. I had $4.2 billion, fear-based respect from my employees, and the envious admiration of my colleagues. I was also, unknowingly, one of the poorest and most miserable people in the country. The auditorium was in absolute silence, each word resonating with the authority of lived experience. Then this extraordinary young woman entered my office and gave me the most important lesson of my life. Maya Vasquez taught me that I had been confusing financial success with human superiority, that I had been wasting opportunities to meet extraordinary people because of stupid prejudices, and that I had been using my privilege to separate instead of connect, to humiliate instead of elevate. Richard looked at Maya, who smiled at him encouragingly. But Maya didn't just humiliate me, though I certainly deserved it. She offered me something much more valuable, the opportunity for redemption. She taught me it's never too late to change, never too late to be better, and that real transformation requires not just recognizing your mistakes, but taking concrete actions to make amends. During this year, I've had the privilege of learning from an extraordinary community of educators, students, working families, refugees, and immigrants who showed me what it really means to contribute to society. I learned that education is the great equalizer, that talent is distributed uniformly, but opportunities are not, and that when we invest in human potential, the returns exceed any financial investment. Richard paused, allowing the words to resonate in the packed auditorium. Today I announce the creation of the Maya Vasquez Foundation for Human Dignity, endowed with $800 million, dedicated to expanding inclusive educational programs throughout America. But more important than the money is the philosophy behind this foundation, the belief that every person, no matter where they were born or how much money their parents have, deserves the opportunity to develop their potential fully. The ovation that followed was immediate and sustained, but Richard raised his hand to continue. However, I don't want this conference to be about me or my money. I want it to be about the people who really made this transformation possible. I want you to hear from Maya Vasquez, who at 13 understands more about leadership, human dignity, and social justice than most adults I know. Richard stepped away from the microphone and gestured to Maya, who approached with the same quiet confidence she had demonstrated during their first encounter. "Thank you, Mr. Sterling," Maya began, her voice clear and firm, resonating throughout the auditorium. "A year ago, when I first entered your office, I wasn't trying to change the world. I was just trying to defend my mother's dignity and demonstrate that a person's worth isn't determined by their job or bank account. But what I've learned during this year is that individual changes can create waves that transform entire communities. When one person decides to see humanity in others, when they decide to use their privilege to create opportunities instead of barriers, when they decide that real success is measured by how much we elevate others, that individual decision can change thousands of lives. Maya looked around the auditorium, making eye contact with students, parents, teachers. The programs we're announcing today aren't just about education, they're about dignity. They're about the fundamental belief that every child, every young person, every adult deserves the opportunity to reach their potential. They're about creating a society where your zip code doesn't determine your destiny, where your parents' work doesn't limit your dreams, where curiosity and effort are rewarded regardless of your background. When Maya finished her presentation, the ovation was different from anything Richard had heard before. It wasn't just applause, it was the sound of collective hope, of recognition that real change was possible, of understanding that they were witnessing the birth of something transformative. After the conference, as the crowd dispersed, Richard found himself alone with Maya and Elena in the transformed boardroom. "How do you feel?" Elena asked, gesturing toward the windows that now showed a city where hundreds of young people had new opportunities thanks to the programs they had created. "I feel like I finally found what my life was made for," Richard responded honestly. "Not to accumulate personal wealth, but to distribute opportunities. Not to demonstrate superiority, but to recognize and nurture greatness in others." "Do you miss your old life?" Maya asked with genuine curiosity. "Do you know what I miss about my old life?" "Nothing. Absolutely nothing," Richard responded, "because I realize now that old life wasn't really living. It was simply existing in a bubble of privilege that separated me from everything that makes life worth living. Real human connections, transcendent purpose, the satisfaction of contributing to others' well-being. Besides," he added with a smile, "it turns out that helping others is the most selfishly satisfying activity that exists. Every time I see a student graduate, every time I see a family break cycles of educational poverty, every time I see a refugee find new hope, I experience a joy that no financial transaction ever gave me." As the sun set over New York City, the three stood in silence for a moment, reflecting on the extraordinary year they had shared and the years of impact to come. "Do you know what the most incredible thing about all this is?" Richard finally broke the silence. "What?" Maya and Elena asked in unison. "This is just the beginning. The $800 million from the foundation will directly touch the lives of at least 75,000 students in the next 5 years. But those students will touch the lives of others, who will touch the lives of others. The impact will multiply exponentially for decades. It's like throwing a stone into a lake," Maya observed. "The ripples keep spreading long after the stone has disappeared." "Exactly. And the original stone was a 12-year-old girl who had the courage to confront a powerful man with the truth," Richard responded. "Maya, you didn't just change my life, you changed the course of thousands of lives you don't even know yet." As they left the room that night, Richard knew he had found something all his previous money could never buy. A legacy that would endure far beyond his own life. A contribution to the world that would be measured not in financial gains, but in opportunities created, dreams realized, cycles of injustice broken. 5 years later, the ripple effects of that transformative day had spread far beyond anything Richard could have imagined. The Maya Vasquez Foundation had grown into a national movement with programs in all 50 states and partnerships with over 200 universities. Richard stood in the same library where Maya had first taught him Mandarin, but now it was named the Elena Vasquez Community Learning Center in honor of the woman who had taught him the true meaning of leadership. The modest building had been expanded into a state-of-the-art facility, but it still maintained its welcoming, accessible spirit. "Mr. Sterling," a familiar voice called out. He turned to see Maya, now 18 years old and a freshman at Harvard on a full scholarship she had earned entirely on merit. She was home for winter break, volunteering as she always did. "Maya, how are your studies going?" Richard asked, embracing her like the daughter she had become to him. "Incredible. But you know what the best part is? Last week, I gave a presentation about our foundation to my international relations class, and 3 of my classmates asked how they could start similar programs in their home countries. Richard smiled. The stone keeps creating ripples. Speaking of ripples, Maya said, her eyes twinkling with excitement, I have something to show you. She led him to a corner of the library where a new section had been added, the Sterling collection of global stories. The walls were covered with letters, photos, and videos from program beneficiaries around the world. Read this one, Maya said, pointing to a letter written in careful English. Dear Mr. Sterling and Miss Maya, my name is Li Wei. 5 years ago, I was a taxi driver in New York, teaching Mandarin at the library on weekends. Today, I am Dr. Li Wei, Director of the International Language Exchange Program at Columbia University. Your foundation sponsored my doctoral studies, and now I train other immigrant educators to become professors. Last month, I helped 47 refugees transition from service jobs to academic careers. The cycle continues. With eternal gratitude, Dr. Li Wei, formerly just the taxi driver. Richard felt his eyes moisten. Ahmed. He goes by Dr. Ahmed Li now. He legally added Li to honor his partnership with Mrs. Chen. They co-authored a book on immigrant wisdom in education that's being used in teacher training programs nationwide. Maya led him to another display. And look at this. It was a newspaper clipping with the headline, Former Janitor Elena Vasquez, named Secretary of Education. The photo showed Elena being sworn in, with Maya and Richard proudly standing beside her. I still can't believe the president appointed her, Richard said, shaking his head in wonder. I can, Maya replied simply. She always was the most qualified person for the job. It just took the world a while to notice. They walked past photos of scholarship recipients who had become doctors, teachers, engineers, and community leaders. Videos of children speaking multiple languages they'd learned for free. Stories of families breaking generational cycles of poverty through education. Maya, Richard said quietly, do you remember what you asked me 5 years ago? About what I was building my empire for? I remember. I finally have a complete answer. I built it so that it could be torn down and rebuilt as something better. I built wealth so that it could be transformed into opportunity. I built walls so that I could learn the joy of tearing them down. Maya smiled, but it was tinged with a wisdom that somehow seemed both ancient and fresh. You know what I think? What? I think you didn't build any of that. I think you discovered it. It was always there, waiting for someone to help you see it. Richard was quiet for a long moment, watching children of all backgrounds learning together, their parents studying in adjacent rooms, elderly immigrants sharing stories with college students. The scene was chaotic, multilingual, beautiful. There's something I never told you, he said finally. What's that? That day you first walked into my office, I wasn't just humiliated. I was saved. I was dying inside that marble tomb I'd built, and I didn't even know it. You didn't just change my perspective, you literally saved my life. Maya looked at him with the same penetrating gaze she'd had at 12, now matured into something even more powerful. Mr. Sterling, can I tell you a secret? Of course. I was terrified that day, absolutely terrified, but my mother always taught me that being brave doesn't mean not being scared, it means doing the right thing even when you are scared. And confronting a billionaire bully was the right thing. Defending my mother was the right thing. Everything else that happened, that was just life responding to a moment of authentic courage. Richard nodded slowly. You know what the strangest part is? What? I spent 52 years trying to prove was better than everyone else, and it made me miserable. I've spent the last 5 years trying to prove that everyone else is just as good as me, and it's made me happier than I ever dreamed possible. That's not strange at all, Maya said. That's just what happens when you finally start living in harmony with the truth instead of fighting against it. As they prepared to leave the library that evening, Richard took one last look around. In 5 years, this place had become more than a building, it had become a symbol. A proof of concept that transformation was possible, that privilege could be redirected toward justice, that even the most hardened hearts could learn to beat in rhythm with the rest of humanity. Maya, he said as they walked toward the exit, I have one more question for you. Shoot, what's next? Where do we go from here? Maya paused at the door, looking back at the bustling learning center, then forward toward the city lights beyond. We keep going, she said simply. We keep teaching, keep learning, keep growing. We keep believing that every person we meet has something extraordinary to offer the world, even if they don't know it yet. We keep being brave enough to see the humanity in others, especially when it's hard. And if we fail sometimes, then we remember that failure is just another word for not finished yet. As they stepped out into the New York evening, Richard realized that his transformation wasn't a story with a neat ending, it was a story with a continuing beginning. Every day brought new opportunities to choose elevation over humiliation, connection over separation, hope over cynicism. The 12-year-old girl who had once confronted a tyrant had grown into a young woman who was now inspiring others to confront their own potential for goodness. The cycle of positive change she had initiated was becoming self-perpetuating, spreading far beyond anything one person or even one foundation could control. And that, Richard understood, was exactly as it should be. The most important lessons couldn't be bought or built or imposed. They could only be shared, one authentic moment at a time, one brave conversation at a time, one act of recognition and dignity at a time. The transformation was not complete, it never would be, but it was real, it was growing, and it was changing the world in ways both seen and unseen. All because a young girl had the courage to speak 7 languages, including the most important one of all, the language of human dignity, the end.